Interslavic is a zonal constructed language based on the Slavic languages. Its purpose is to facilitate communication between representatives of different Slavic nations, as well as to allow people who do not know any Slavic language to communicate with Slaversus for the latter. It can fulfill an educational role as well. Interslavic can be classified as a semi-artificial language. It is essentially a modern continuation of Old Church Slavonic, but also draws on the various improvised language forms Slavs have been using for centuries to communicate with Slavs of other nationalities, for example in multi-Slavic environments and on the Internet, providing them with a scientific base. Thus, both grammar and vocabulary are based on the commonalities between the Slavic languages, and artificial elements are avoided. Its main focus lies on instant understandability rather than easy learning, a balance typical for naturalistic languages. The language has a long history, predating constructed languages like Volapük and Esperanto by centuries. The oldest description, written by the Croatian priest Đurić Kršanić, goes back to the years 1659 to 1666. In its current form, Interslavic was created in 2006 under the name Slovianski. In 2011, Slovianski underwent a thorough reform and merged with two other projects, simultaneously changing its name to Interslavic, a name that was first proposed by the Czech Ignác Hořič in 1908. Interslavic can be written using the Latin and the Cyrillic alphabets. Background: the history of the Interslavic or Panslavic language is closely connected with Panslavism, an ideology that endeavors cultural and political unification of all Slavs, based on the conception that all Slavic people are part of a single Slavic nation. Along with this belief came also the need for a Slavic umbrella language. A strong candidate for that position was Russian, the language of the largest Slavic state and also mother tongue of more than half of the Slaversus. This option enjoyed most of its popularity in Russia itself, but was also favored by Panslavists abroad, for example the Slovak Ľudovít Strana. Others believed that Old Church Slavonic was a better and also more neutral solution. In previous centuries, this language had served as an administrative language in a large part of the Slavic world, and it was still used on a large scale in Orthodox liturgy, where it played a role similar to Latin in the West. Old Church Slavonic had the additional advantage of being very similar to the common ancestor of the Slavic languages, Proto-Slavic. However, Old Church Slavonic had several practical disadvantages as well. It was written in a highly archaic form of Cyrillic. Grammar was complex and its vocabulary was characterized by many obsolete words as well as the absence of words for modern concepts. Hence, early examples of Panslavic language projects were aimed at modernizing Old Church Slavonic and adapting it to the needs of everyday communication. Early projects. The first Interslavic grammar, Gramatikno iz Kazani obraskom jeziku by the Croatian priest Đurić Kršanić, was written in 1665. He referred to the language as Ruski, but in reality it was mostly based on a mixture of the Russian edition of Church Slavonic and his own Akavian dialect of Serbo-Croatian. Kršanić used it not only for this grammar, but also in other works, including the treatise Politica. According to an analysis of the Dutch slavist Tom McMahon, 59% of the words used in Politica are of common Slavic descent. 10% come from Russian and Church Slavonic, 9% from Serbo-Croatian and 2.5% from Polish. It should be noted that Kršanić was not the first who attempted writing in a language understandable to all Slaversus. In 1583 another Croatian priest, Sime Budinik, had translated the Summa Doctrinae Christianae by Petrus Canisius into Slovansky, in which he used both the Latin and Cyrillic alphabets. After Krasanic, numerous other efforts have been made to create an umbrella language from the speakers of Slavic languages. A notable example is Universalis Lingua Slavica by the Slovak attorney Jan Herkel, published in Latin and in Slovak in 1826. Unlike Krasanic project, this project was closer to the West Slavic languages. During the second half of the 19th century, Pan-Slavic language projects were mostly the domain of Slovenes and Croats. In this era of awakening national consciousness, the Russians were the only Slavs who had their own state. Other Slavic peoples inhabited large, mostly non-Slavic states, and clear borders between the various nations were mostly lacking. Among the numerous efforts at creating written standards for the South Slavic languages, there were also efforts at establishing a common South Slavic language, Illyrian, that might also serve as a literary language for all Slavs in the future. Of special importance is the work of Apiya, who was a Slovenian Austro-Slavist who later converted to Panslavism. In 1865 he published Uzajemni pravopis Slaviansky. In this work, he postulated that the best way for Slavs to communicate with other Slavs was taking own language as a starting point and then modifying it in steps. First, he proposed changing the orthography of each individual language into a generic Pan-Slavic orthography. Subsequently, he described a grammar that was based on comparing the 5 major Slavic languages of his days: Old Church Slavonic, Russian, Polish, Czech and Serbian. Apart from a book about the language itself, Maja also used it for a biography of Cyril and Methodius and for a magazine he published in the years 1873 to 1875. Slavjin, a fragment in the language, can still be seen on the altar of Majar's church in Gorchak. Other Pan-Slavic language projects were published in the same period by the Croatian Matija Ban, the Slovenes Radoslav Razlag and Bozidar Raic, as well as the Macedonian Grigor Palichev, all based on the idea of combining Old Church Slavonic with elements from the modern South Slavic languages. Authors of Pan-Slavic language projects in the 19th century. All authors mentioned above were motivated by the belief that all Slavic languages were dialects of one single Slavic language rather than separate languages. They deplored the fact that these dialects had diverged beyond mutual comprehensibility, and the Pan-Slavic language they envisioned was intended to reverse this process. The long-term objective was that this language would replace the individual Slavic languages. Maja, for example, compared the Pan-Slavic language with standardized languages like Ancient Greek and several modern languages. Consequently, these authors did not consider the project's constructed languages at all. In most cases they provided grammatical comparisons between the Slavic languages, sometimes but not always offering solutions they labeled as Pan-Slavic. What the projects have in common that they neither have a rigidly prescriptive grammar nor a separate vocabulary. The 20th century. In the early 20th century it had become clear that the divergation of the Slavic languages was irreversible and the concept of a Pan-Slavic literary language was no longer realistic. The Pan-Slavic dream had lost most of its power, and Panslavists had to satisfy themselves with the formation of 2 multinational Slavic states, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. However, the need for a common language of communication for Slavs was still felt, and due to the influence of artificial languages like Esperanto, efforts were made to create a language that was no longer supposed to replace the individual original Slavic languages, but to serve as an additional second language for inter-Slavic communication. In the same period, the nexus of inter-Slavic activity shifted to the north, especially to the Czech lands. In 1907, the Czech dialectologist Ignác Hořič published a Grammar of Neuslavic, a proposal for a common literary language for all Slavs within the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. 5 years later, another Czech, Josef Konečný, published Slovena, a Slavic Esperanto, which however had very little in common with Esperanto, but instead was mostly based on Czech. Whereas these two projects were naturalistic, the same cannot be said about two other projects by Czech authors, Slavastina by Edmund Kolkop and Slavský jazyk by Bohumil Holy. Both projects, published in 1912 and 1920 respectively, show a clear tendency towards simplification, for example by eliminating grammatical gender and cases and schematicism. During the 1950s, the Czech poet and former Esperantist Ladislav Podmel, also known under his pseudonym Jiří Karan, worked for several years with a team of prominent interlinguists on an elaborate project, Mezdoslavianský jazyk. Among other things, they wrote a grammar, an Esperanto inter-Slavic word list, a dictionary, a course and a textbook. Although none of those were ever published, the project gained some attention of linguists from various countries, probably due to the political reality of those days. This language was primarily based on Russian. The digital age. Although Panslavism has not played a role of any significance since the collapse of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, globalization and new media like the Internet have led to a renewed interest in a language that would be understandable for all Slavs alike. Older projects were largely forgotten, but as it became relatively easy for authors of new projects to publish the work, several new projects emerged. Most of them originated from Slavic émigré circles. During the first years of the 21st century, especially Slovio of the Slovak Mark Hucko acquired some fame. Unlike most previous projects, it was not a naturalistic but a schematic language, its grammar being based largely on Esperanto. Slovio was not only intended to serve as an auxiliary language for Slavs, but also for use on a global scale like Esperanto. For that reason it gained little acceptance among Slavs. A high degree of simplification, characteristic for most international auxiliary languages, makes it easier to learn for non-Slavs, but widens the distance with the natural Slavic languages and gives the language an overly synthetic character, which by many is considered a disadvantage. In March 2006, the Slaviansky project was started by a group of people from different countries, who felt the need for a simple and neutral Slavic language that the Slavs could understand without prior learning. The language they envisioned should be naturalistic and only consist of material existing in all or most Slavic languages, without any artificial additions. Initially, Sloviansky was being developed in two different variants, a naturalistic version known as Sloviansky N, and a more simplified version known as Sloviansky P. The difference was that Sloviansky N had 6 grammatical cases, while Sloviansky P, like English, Bulgarian and Macedonian, used prepositions instead. Apart from these two variants, the schematic version, Sloviansky S, has been experimented with as well, but was abandoned in an early stage of the project. In 2009 it was decided that only the naturalistic version would be continued under the name Sloviansky. Although Sloviansky had 3 genders, 6 cases and full conjugation of verbs, features usually avoided in international auxiliary languages, a high level of simplification was achieved by means of simple, unambiguous endings and irregularity being kept to a minimum. Sloviansky was most mostly used in internet traffic and in a newsletter, Slovianska Gazeta. In February and March 2010 there was much publicity about Slovianski after articles had been dedicated to it on the Polish internet portal Interia Place and the Serbian newspaper Večernje Novosti. Shortly thereafter, articles about Slovianski appeared in the Slovak newspaper Pravda on the news site of the Czech broadcasting station CT24, in the Serbian blogosphere Jeden Jezik Zares VE Slovene and the Serbian edition of Reader's Digest, as well as other newspapers and internet portals in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria and Ukraine. Slovianski has played a role in the development of other related projects as well. Rozumio and Slovioski were both efforts to build a bridge between Slovianski and Slovio. Originally, Slovioski was merely intended to reform Slovio, but gradually it developed into a separate language. Like Slovianski, it was a collaborative project that existed in two variants, a full and a simplified version. In January 2010 a new language was published, Neo-Slavonic, by the Czech Vojitek Marunka, based on Old Church Slavonic grammar but using part of Slovianski's vocabulary. In 2011 Slovianski, Slovioski and Novoslavinsky merged into one common project under the name Interslavic. Slovianski grammar and dictionary were expanded to include all options of Neo-Slavonic as well, turning it into a more flexible language based on prototypes rather than fixed rules. For that time, Slovianski and Neo-Slavonic have no longer been developed as separate projects, even though their names are still frequently in use as synonyms or dialects of Interslavic. In the same year, the various simplified forms of Slovianski and Slovioski that were meant to meet the needs of beginners and non-Slavs were reworked into a highly simplified form of Interslavic. Slovian 2. Community. Interslavic has an active community, including an internet forum with around 350 members and 2 Facebook groups with more than 600 and 400 members respectively. Furthermore, the project has an online news portal and a wiki. The number of people who speak Interslavic is difficult to establish. The lack of demographic data is a common problem among constructed languages, so that estimates are always rough. The Bulgarian author G. Ilyev mentions a number of several hundreds of speakers in 2012. The language's Facebook page mentions 4,600 speakers. Alphabet. One of the main principles of Interslavic is that it can be written on any Slavic keyboard. The border between Latin and Cyrillic runs through the middle of Slavic territory, and therefore both alphabets can be used. Because of the differences between, for example, the Polish alphabet and other Latin alphabets, as well as between Serbian, Macedonian Cyrillic and other forms of Cyrillic, Interslavic has no official orthography, but uses a prototype orthography instead, which means that many phonemes can be written and pronounced in various ways. For example, the distinction between hard and soft consonants, characteristic for the West and East Slavic languages, is optional both in speaking and in writing. Because Interslavic is not an ethnic language, there are no severe rules regarding accentuation either. What all varieties of Interslavic have in common is the following basic set of phonemes that can be found in all Slavic languages. Apart from the basic alphabet above, other characters are used as well, usually carrying a diacritic, convey additional etymological information and linking directly to Proto-Slavic and Old Church Slavonic. The usage is not mandatory. The purpose of these characters is threefold. They allow for a more precise pronunciation, because sound changes from Proto-Slavic tend to be regular in all Slavic languages. They can be linked to a particular phoneme in every individual Slavic language, thus enhancing comprehensibility. By writing and/or pronouncing them in a different way, they can be used to manipulate the language in such way that it becomes more understandable for speakers of particular languages. At last, the following ligatures can also be encountered in Interslavic soft consonants. The consonants L, N, R, T, D, S and Z are softened or palatalized counterparts of L, N, R, T, D, S and Z. The latter may also be pronounced like the softened, palatalized equivalents before one E and possibly before E. This pronunciation is not mandatory, though they may as well be written and pronounced hard. Soft consonants are normally represented by an acute or a hatchak, but other ways of writing are possible as well, N, J, N, etc. To avoid texts from becoming heavy on diacritics, it is recommended that before a vowel, soft consonants are written as a hard consonant followed by J, nom, con, gen, konya.